はい。では多分まだ
Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's not the end of 20-minute break yet, but we're running out of time, so we would like to suggest to open up the panel discussion here. My name is... I am the moderator for this panel discussion. My name is Yuta Hirai. Good to meet you all. Okay, let's start. First of all, we would like to ask Mr. Geston to give us a report. Mr. Meskens, please.
Meskens, please.
Thank you. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to open this panel with some kind of statement. I also delivered at the Art Academy in Amsterdam. So that was for an art audience, and this is for like a mixed audience of activists, artists, and scientists. So the title of this statement is The Consolatory Practice of Living on Reflexivity as Art Activism in the Age of Populism, Positivism, and Profitism. In 2006, I attended the United Nations meeting in New York, and I was on that occasion present at the opening reception of the World Press Photo Award exhibition that was set up in the United Nations headquarters building. Walking through the exhibition, I came across this photo. It was awarded in the category Portraits and shot by a freelance photographer who, by order of Greenpeace International, aimed to document the social misery in the aftermath of the nuclear accident of Chernobyl. Natasha Popova and Vadim Kuleshov live in the Vesnova orphanage near Chernobyl. Natasha was born with microcephaly. Her head is abnormally small. Vadim has a bone disease and is mentally retarded. In 2005, when the picture was taken, Natasha was 12 and Vadim 8. And this simple detail reveals that there is a serious problem with the credibility of this photo. The problem is due to scientific uncertainty. In simple language, the link between radioactivity and Natasha's microcephaly or Vadim's bone disease as a hereditary effect cannot be proven. At the time of the accident, their mothers were not pregnant yet. They were probably still children themselves. On the other hand, there seems to be a link between the fetus receiving a significant dose of radioactivity and the possible development of microcephaly. And we know that from the atomic bomb explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Among the survivors, 11 pregnant women were registered as having received a high radiation dose. 7 of them gave birth to a child with microcephaly. That is sadly statistically significant. Now, it is important to note that the photographer and the organizers of the World Press Photo Award are aware of this complexity. The award's website comments with a photo that it is not known for certain whether exposure to radiation can be linked to such conditions. Greenpeace International, in commenting on the winning of the award on its website, does not mention this reflection, and thus at least suggests that the children developed the diseases due to Chernobyl. What do we learn from this? There is nobody to accuse or of providing misleading information. Many of those who believe in nuclear energy tend to believe that there is no link between the Chernobyl radiation and the children's bad luck, and would criticize the photo on its misleading message. Many of those who are against nuclear energy believe that there is a link and will use the photo as a proof of the perverse adverse effects of nuclear accidents. The photo and the children serve the conviction of both camps, and no side makes an attempt to seek conciliation with the other. With their simplified rationals, they contribute to polarization over the issue, and in this way, to the comfort situation in this polarization. In other words, they contribute to the comfort of polarization that is typical for our times. What do I mean with the idea of the comfort of polarization? If a polarization denotes a sharpening of differences of opinion between two camps constructed around opposing rationals, then a comfort of polarization will emerge with strategic and populist simplifications of those opposing rationals. As these camps then turn into non-overlapping comfort zones, constructed around the own self-conformative truths. As in a joint conspiracy, both camps will make no effort anymore to influence and convince each other. Together with a photo, their opposing opinions lead an elegant life in those non-overlapping circles sympathetic to their interests and rationals. Among the victims of this strategic comfort situation are the citizens all over the world who remain confused by the conflicting messages and, last but not least, Natasha and Vadim. The comfort of polarization. The sad story of the Chernobyl children is but one example of how the world of today remains stuck in various comforts of polarization. And we see these as well afflicting the way we try to organize our society, as the way we try to make sense of the big questions in life. Next to the religious versus scientific explanation of our origin and destiny, we have the ideas of a collective identity versus another collective identity, communitarism versus personal freedom, socialism versus liberalism, one scientific truth versus an alternative scientific truth. We don't live in a society enriched by pluralism and multiculturality, but in a world that struggles with the comforts of polarization. And from a general perspective, I think this is due to the fact that we did not advance yet beyond the old thinking modes inherited from modernity. Let me briefly comment on this. Today, we have what we could call three modern governing modes concerned with the organization of our society: representative democracy, the liberal market, and science. They are modern because they can be seen as results of modernity as an emancipation process. Typical for modernity is the fact that these governing modes do not question the legitimacy of their own authority, as what they do is tested by some form of internal control. The legitimate authority of representative democracy as the search for compromise through organized conflict of opinion between distinct ideological parties and enclosed within the nation state. The liberal market as a self-corrective system of competition that automatically annihilates unsuccessful commercial projects and that serves as the motor for innovation. Science in its reliance upon the scientific method and self-control through peer review. But the social challenges we face today are ultimately complex. Structural poverty, expanding industrialization and urbanization, and consequent environmental degradation. Spill of precious resources, water, food and products, adverse manifestations of technological risk, economic exploitation, anticipated overpopulation, and derailed financial markets. All of this adding up to old and new forms of social, political, and cultural oppression and conflict. The problems we are now interrelated and need to be tackled at the global level. The need to take action is manifest. The stakes are high and the challenges ahead are ultimately complex. This not only because there are multiple uncertainties to take into account, but also because of the plurality of views on problems and solutions. Now, taking this complexity serious, the idea is that our traditional working modes of democracy, the market, and science are not longer able to grasp the complexity of these global social challenges. What do I mean with this? Today, we know that the way these governing modes interpret and legitimize their own authority is criticized. For each of them, the critique may be summarized in the following way. The working of representative democracy, inspired by the ideology of organized conflict and practiced through elections and party politics, tends to cause strategic simplification of issues, to match party ideologies, populism, and political self-protection. A self-corrective liberal market is apparently not able to determine its own ethics. Science, social critique is mainly directed to politics and the market, but the example of the Chernobyl children shows that also the role of science deserves special attention. Science is under pressure from politics and the market, but we have to realize that the main product of science towards society is not any longer empirical evidence to prove or reject a specific hypothesis, but the hypothesis itself. The challenge of science is not any longer the production of credible proofs, it is the production of credible hypotheses. Now, taking into account that current politics lead to polarization, that markets are unable to determine their own ethics, and that science is not anymore the science of proof, but of hypothesis, we have to realize that political trust, commercial quality, and scientific objectivity cannot longer be guaranteed by politics, the market, and science themselves. They need to be acquired through interaction with society. So for politics, the market, and science, recognizing the limits to their own internal logic is a form of intellectual solidarity. And opening up their internal logic to deliberation with society is their social responsibility. Entering art and the artist. The photo of the Chernobyl children is not art, it's politics. It is especially made and shown with the aim to suggest a political truth, although on loose factual grounds. That is exactly the opposite of what art wants to be today, at least in the way I see it. Simply said, making contemporary art is not anymore the deliverance of finished autonomous products, works, but a process of thinking in public. Being an artist today is being reflexive in public. Since modernity, art has joined the social critique on politics, science, and the market. But critique through art is not evident. How to criticize strategic simplifications and manipulations of rationals through a medium that takes the freedom not needing to be rational itself? In other words, in a complex, unjust, and unsustainable world where fundamentalism in politics, the market, science, and religion makes them to refuse to recognize the limits to their own rationals and the relativity of their own truth, it is for critical art not simply a matter of choosing side with the activists. Art cannot directly debunk suspicious scientific or religious truths, or counter unjust political and economic rationals. But that inability does not need to be understood as a crisis or the end of socially engaged art. On the contrary, beyond polarization, the future of critique is in its dialectical potential, not in the development of better counter-arguments. And here is the potential for art. It is precisely the critical potential of contemporary art to show the limits of rationals and the relativity of truths of politics, science, and the market, either in a poetic or in a polemic way, either in the private or in the public sphere, that makes socially engaged art today more relevant than ever before. The reason is that this critical potential of art can rely on its experience with critical self-reflection. Compared to politics, the market and science, since modernity, art has been the only human formal interaction mode that has undertaken an inquiry of the own credibility. And this by integrating this inquiry into the own art practice. Neither enlightened modern politics or science nor the market has organized a comparable self-critical reflection process up till today. But what about intellectual solidarity? While intellectual solidarity could be called the prime social responsibility of politics, the market, and science, art as a contemporary social practice should not bother about it. Art should not care about intellectual solidarity. The contemporary artist is not elected, does not promise to satisfy our needs, and has nothing to prove. Artists can pretend to tell the truth, they are allowed to mislead the public, and they can sell any price, set any price on works without the need to rationally justify it. But that does not set them free from social responsibility. Artists have a very specific social responsibility. They have to recognize that there is no rationale to justify their being as artists, and this can be sketched in two perspectives. The first perspective is political. A society that cares about social and human well-being cares about art. We can only hope that politicians think the same way and are serious when they say they think the same way. But that statement is not rational but ethical. We cannot prove that we need art in society. We can only jointly agree to care for its being. The second perspective is poetical and concerns socially engaged art in its potential to be activist art. The fate of activism through art is that, in order for it to generate controllable social or political effect, it would need to become social work or politics itself. On the other hand, the artistic act of critical withdrawal will eventually appeal to an art audience, but it will not bother those cynically detached subjects of critique. The impossible position of artistic activism is not that of a dilemma between withdrawal or contribution. It is that of a dwelling in a twilight zone between those two positions. With a constant awareness of the conditions and implications of agency, it is a state of hyper-reflexivity that, at the same time, also works as a critical mirror towards the cynically detached. As a deliberate state of engagement and as an active state of resignation, that position at the periphery of the artist's comfort zone is also ultimately melancholic. The artist knows no comfort zones. Art is engaging in the consolatory practice of leaving the own comfort zone. Activist art can show politics, the market, science, religion, citizens, and activists why and how they would need to leave their own comfort zones themselves. That practice is critical ethical, but at the same time consolatory aesthetical. Thank you.
It was a big theme. It's about art and science. There was a big question being posed here. I personally graduated from the art school in New York, and I'm from Tokyo. And having said that, however, I am involved in measuring all the soils in Fukushima. So I'm in the field, but I also have a scientific perspective, so I resonated well from that perspective. So I'm sitting in the middle of two circles, and that's why I serve as a moderator here. And what's happening in Fukushima being conveyed to people was part of my profession, and all the panelists here in the room, more than half of them I know for quite some time. And Mr. Mesken's message suggests the question, what are the art? What are the science? How can we define the two? Genome perspective. There has been a research done from a genome perspective, how people should be. It's about the expression, and this gentleman's been involved in the field in Fukushima. So I would like to now ask Dr. Kojima to talk about what science is and what art is from your perspective, sir. Well, I'm specialized in genome science, so it's about reading in human genes and also protein constructs. It's something that I specialize on. In the 21st century, the science itself has changed dramatically. From a methodology perspective, there is a Fisher statistics now moved to the Bayes approach. So there was a transformation in terms of the approach as well, which is huge. And in the biological sense, there were a different approach being conducted. Data-dependent science, data-driven science is something that we pursue now. So it's a huge shift. And Bayes assumption. Some of you might know, some of you might not know. The most well-known example is Montefiore issue in US. In the market, this became a huge issue with regards to the approach. There are 3 doors in the TV program. And behind the door, there's one right answer out of 3. And Montefiore is the MC. And the winner of the quiz get to choose one door. And let's say I'm the winner and I choose the door A. Then the MC, Montefiore, says, look at B and C. And C is the wrong answer, he says. And Montefiore, when he asks a question to the respondents, are you going to sure you stick to A or you want to change to B? Then, when you hear the answer, most of the people, probability is 1/3, the same for A and B. That's a Fisher statistics. So the probability won't change, but when it comes to Bayes assumption, it's better twice if you switch to B. That's the assumption. Because you choose door A, that's the probability is 1/3. B or C, that's 2/3. And Bayes approach, the assumption changes always. So B or C, and if you choose C, then the probability of 2/3 goes to B, and A still has 1/3 of probability. So we are going through many simulations, and we have Monte Carlo approach, and we just use a random table to create numbers. And we think lots of cases in our experiments. And when we apply the numbers in the random table, then the probability for A is 1/3. That's the conclusion we can reach. And the probability for B is 2/3. So probability, the more data, the probability can change as you see more and more data coming in. So probability changes. That means as we go through the calculation, the number gets huge, the data gets huge. Fisher was strongly opposing to the Bayes assumption, Bayes approach. And Bayes approach is now available in our world, and that's in the middle of World War II, 21st century. Alan Turing, in order to solve the German enigma, it's not a Turing machine, but Bombay, Colossus, those computers are being created. And for the first time, Bayesian approach became available. But as for the Bayes approach, Bayes assumption, it has a very complex history. Back UK, Churchill, the prime minister back then, from UK, Colossus, can now solve the code of US and UK. So he crashed, destroyed everything. And he is criticized as a gay person, and he was withdrawn from the society. But when it comes to Bayes' approach, it remained as one of the military options. For example, if there's a hydrogen bombs and it's missing, it's gone missing, or the nuclear reactor problems can be assumed, Rasmus Ray can adopt this Bayes assumption approach as well. Bayes assumption has some challenges. The Bayes approach, as I said before, I mentioned about, just like Mr. Meskens talked about, Fisher statistics has certain events, and you can use paper and pencil, and you can calculate. It's a very simplified approach. So for us handling biology, we can have a Gauss. There's no events that can be applied for the Gauss distribution, but the current approach, the statistics, it goes back to you can identify whether the anomaly is 5% or so out of the distribution. And my specialty is on cholesterol or creating drugs for their daily diseases. And there's no trust I can have with this based upon my mega study. Fisher approach cannot be applicable to solve the reality problems, because the problems in reality, there is a very complex internal structure inside the human beings. And the distribution, if you do need a base assumption and then make an assumption about human bodies. And when you look at the patients one by one, you have to change the assumption as the time goes by. But with Fisher statistics, you use the same model, and then you do need to see the predominance of it. So in the field of science, everything is based upon the Bayes approach, and we go through a huge statistical calculation. But if you start applying Bayes approach to science, something crazy happens, because Bayes assumption has a model based upon experience, and then you keep adding the data. So there are two challenges with this. From certain point of time, the Bayes approach, the model based upon experience, instead of model based upon experience, any kind of subjective model is okay, people started to say. And that is so-called the Bayes statistics used in US market. And that's very different from Bayesian view approach. So the question is, how this original model is accurate or not. This is very important. Well, I look into the protein structure, and in the conference held in UK or London, and that 3D protein is converted to 2D. And we reconstruct 2D again back to 3D. So that means double vagueness, double ambiguity. For example, CCTV camera, you can detect some criminals. It's just like that. So first of all, not knowing what 3D model is, and you don't know which angle that entity is being taken. So there are double ambiguity, and that needs to be solved. So the criminal, whether he's a male or she, a female, dependent on the face, you can capture data from 2D back to 3D. You can manipulate any way you want. So noise from Einstein. For example, out of tens of millions of items, you can just pick up that looks like Einstein and then bring it back to 3D. And then there is a protein that looks exactly like Einstein if we deliberately choose certain points. If we use the Bayes assumption, then you have to first focus on the accuracy level of the original model. Next is, if you're handling big data, if you don't use the wrong poor filter, you have to go through a humongous amount of calculation required, degree is being reduced, and it faces some challenges. It goes back to the science and art challenges. Science and art, when human beings look at certain events, you need to reduce the dimensions. That's how I look at things. For example, art, Shakespeare, looks at the truth of society, truth of human beings, and that's his way of reflecting the world. 3D, going back to 2D. That means change in information.
We have the five senses, how the words or quiver, and people's attitude is also an important perception. And in that sense, the DSM-5 in the United States is a very interesting element. The basis of diagnosis of psychological or psychiatric disorder is all based on the interview, the behavior, the words which all can be quantified. So the Bayes approach in that sense started with the inclusion of the original data, which is important. And in that sense, if art is a reflection of reality, then the data that we obtain from art in that sense is extremely meaningful for science itself. Thank you very much. Well, I have one very basic question. Earlier, what Mr. Meskin said that science only provides hypothesis, not the proof. And within science, what is the percentage of such hypothesis, and what is required to reverse that? Well, if you apply the Bayes approach, then if the conclusion is radical, no matter how much data, it's very difficult to obtain the consensus. But what is very commonly known is the Bayes approach is used for the junk mails, and Siri on the Apple's application also use a similar kind of approach, which allows, for example, to have much higher probabilities of hitting junk mails. So the original model and the data amount have to be very accurate. These are the two important conditions, I understand. So data collection, well, Shingo, in your presentation earlier, you were talking about misleading or misusing certain data, or creating average and in a way dissipating or making the information weaker. That's something that you had said. Based on what Mr. Kodama said, what did you think? Well, after the lecture, actually I was able to talk directly with Professor Kodama, sorry. Earlier, what I was trying to show using the infographics was, in a way, a very elementary data or elementary manipulation of image or data. So in that sense, it's very far from the leading science and technology on what's happening to data today. So I would like to apologize because there's a huge gap between. But what I wanted to say in my presentation is that at the expert level, be it science or economics or statistics, what's happening in these leading areas of study, and what we see in the media, in the mass media, including television, magazines, newspapers, well, in a way, the mass media are diluting the information. Perhaps you can say that so that people can understand in a friendly manner. But at the same time, there are certain bias that is created. Maybe biased is I don't mean to use bias in the wrong way, but when it comes to a very sensitive issue like nuclear power or radiation, we all know that there are taboo issues. And after the World War II, and at the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and up until now, there must be a lot of things, a lot of important data that are not talked about or not even announced. So, from new perspective, perhaps we need to look back and reflect on the existing data as well. So maybe the word taboo, by the way, I believe was originally a word from Tonga, I believe, that means sacred. Taboo originally means sacred, that you should not step into a certain area from out of respect for the nature, out of awe for the nature. And in that sense, nuclear perhaps is a taboo because there is something that is very striking the essence of humans. Maybe I'm diverting from the main topic, but the data that we can really treat as black and white and other elements that are much more ambiguous, like our sentiments, these are and the real-time experience of human beings, the real-time emotions of human beings as we live our lives. And as we are exposed with the external pressures, in a way, these should be considered in the same way as data, I believe. Well, thank you. Shingo, today you are here as a citizen scientist, but you are a musician. You are very well known internationally as a musician. Not really. Well, you have a very long career as a musician. And in your activity, through music, you communicate using music. But because of the March 11th, well, perhaps before as well, but you come to deal with the radiation, and now you participate in this topic of between science and arts. I think you really lived in between science and arts and in both worlds in that sense. And Mako-san, you are a comedian. Well, music and comedy is quite different, but it's also different forms of expressions. And perhaps in the society, a lot of people must ask you, why are you active in this area, being a comedian? From your experience, can you tell us about your experience of being between the arts as a comedian and science? Well, actually, I'm really so impressed by what Professor Kodama said, actually. Well, I'm a comedian, and I'm reporting on the nuclear accident, and I really had hard time going through. I had anger, I had a sense of purpose, but when I started, but what I was concerned most about are the people, the victims, people who are afflicted by the disaster, and I really didn't want to offend them. That was my primordial concern. So when I started my reporting very early on in 2011, I went to Iwaki, Itate, and in these areas, and I came to be friendly with many mothers living there. And I asked them directly many, many times, is it okay for a comedian like myself to be reporting about nuclear accidents? Well, what they said was, well, they said they have no idea what nuclear accident is, the radiation is. They have no idea. However, there has been so many experts who came to us. They came to talk to us in a very serious manner, but it was so confusing, and we didn't understand fully. But by us coming, the comedians coming, and talking to them. When we talk about nuclear accident or radiation, we talk in a much easy to understand way, and sometimes we insert some comic relief at the same time, and they can listen to us. So they said that they're grateful. Well, Professor Kodama, I was so interested in what you just said about Bayes' approach. Well, I have a friend who's a researcher who's using an analytical Bayes model. And I was wondering, what is an analytical Bayes model? So, and I finally understood what Bayes model was thanks to your talk just now. And when we talk about arts and science earlier, we were talking about Da Vinci. Well, the arts and science both try to understand nature. And Professor Kodama, what you said that analytical Bayes model is currently now trying to reflect the various issues and challenges in science and society. So going back to Chernobyl, the polarization is an issue. I do believe that polarization is an issue, but what I feel in my current activity reporting and what I doubt what I'm concerned most is the following. Well, what is most difficult to talk about now is that there are people who are saying that nuclear accident, well, that's no problem, versus other people who are saying this is a huge crisis. This is a China syndrome. These two factions really cannot talk to each other. It's maybe not a polarization, but there are much more different stages in between the two. But in reality, reality is not polarized, but reality is very hard to grasp. And so that is why, be it Bayes reality or be it arts, I think it's a very effective way of grasping reality.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meskens, the keyword, the comfort zone being mentioned, the comfort zone being created between two circles, and the artist can play a role in that scenario. We should not stay in the comfort zone. We should leave the comfort zone intentionally. That is why the artist can play a big role. I think that's the message of the presentation. Professor Nagahata, back in 2011, when I did the report, I went to Fukushima University, and I had some article coverage back then. And according to your understanding, sir, well, you're a professional on sounds, and you belong to the engineering science side. And in April 2011, the Fukushima University already made a safety declaration, but you made some statement against that chair, and you took a action very quickly. So why were you able to take action very quickly? Because you were away from the comfort zone? That's the way I look at it. But what was behind? Were you aware of this yourself, or why was I able to take action quickly? Because I focused on noise and the noise issue. Well, it's just like radiation problem. The similarity there is that you don't die from loud sounds, right? You live in a very noisy place, but you don't die from it. That's what people think. But the impact of noise on human health, for example, can lead to certain diseases. Epidemiologic view, you could die from it because it could impact the heart from noise. But that's not well known throughout Japan. So it's handled lightly compared to the other issues. And when it comes to radiation, when the radiation problem came out, the first thing I saw was that everything, well, people living very close by the nuclear power plant, there was suggestion to run away. But, well, Fukushima City, where Fukushima University belongs to, dose is not that high. So people living in that area, including myself, well, you're okay with this dose level. That was the only thing we were notified And it's just as if the noise problem was handled, and that's no good, I thought. So if I can resolve this problem, maybe I can take a similar approach resolving the noise problem as well, I thought. Therefore, so I had different motives. I look at it very differently. So the issue that I used to focus, it's like an applied, advanced level of the problems that came out. And unless I become proactive making statements, opinions as a researcher, it's as if I deny myself as a researcher if I don't speak up when something similar happened. So I decided that I should tackle both problems, noise and radiation. And also, I have my own profession, especially my field. As you saw my film, it's about art, society, science. It's a mixture of those disciplines. So I want to take advantage of that, my profession. Usually siloed, certain experts talking about only their expertise. But in my case, it doesn't work that way. So I can suggest mixture, interdisciplinary approach towards the challenges. And that's why I wanted to take advantage of my positioning, just to send out certain messages out to people. Thank you very much. As an artist, after 311, who took action? What kind of expression being exposed by artists? Well, I graduated from art school myself, and I had certain perspectives. And Nodin also started taking action after 311. And in your talk, you talked about the profession in advertisement field, and you decided to reflect back on yourself. So, artists who took action, artists who didn't take action. And you were the artist who took action. And what's the motive behind that? What I can say, what can I tell myself? This was tested back then, after 311. What I mean is that I'm sure there are certain taboos with regards to the nuclear accident. We have to show compassion to people in Fukushima, and that sometimes resort us to say certain things. We might refrain from saying certain things because we don't want to hurt people of those people in Fukushima. So, let's say that art belongs to good and bad, but can we just freely say whatever we feel like without worrying about hurting people's feelings? The answer is no. So, our gentleness, our compassion, how can we deliver that? Was something that we all struggled. And some people stopped saying certain things because they didn't want to hurt some people. But what we saw in that process was that there's a structure, there's a mechanism in place, how the society is being milled. And that was symbolized by this accident. My point is that the art, so-called the art in the past, for the sake of patron, for the sake of money, the art was being created. It could be in Basel, art fair, in the art market. In order to have higher value, certain art piece might exist. And that happened in the past. And with that in mind, the question is, what is art? We don't know. I wanted to get rid of that framework, boundaries. I don't know what I'm doing is considered art or not. Whatever I can take courage to say certain things that could threaten me myself, but I try so hard to speak up. Or the conflicts in the world, I pay attention to that. I want to let people know about that conflict. I think that can be considered an art as well. That was my feeling. And I'm sure there are lots of traps. It's not only the capitalism traps, as Mr. Meskin mentioned. He showed the photos. That's a trap. It's about the expression. It's like a craft alchemist. You tend to be acting like an alchemist. You think you're almighty, but you have to be careful as an artist that you won't go into the trap. So you can rather identify and tell people that there are certain traps. And that's how we can face our own conflicts. Something that we're blind about it, that can be identified, and then we can put it on the table, we can think about it together. I think artists can play that role.
Thank you. The role of arts in the society, when we think about that, well, I'm talking about myself a bit, but I went to Fukushima and I started measuring the radiation dosage in fields and rice paddies, and that led to, well, in a way, sometimes I felt that this is a work of art or expression. But at the same time, it was necessary to communicate our activity to the society. How do we communicate? What words do we use? And those are also important. Tange-san, you talked about reputational harm or damage. And Professor Kageura, early you said contract and confidence. I really cannot explain what it is about, but you said confidence and contract between the recipient and the emitter. That recipient has to have certain attitudes so that the communication is established and message is transmitted. Well, can you talk a bit more about that? Well, very completely aware from my expertise. I just happen to be in a place where I'm voicing about nuclear accident after March 11th. But, however, I would like to talk about, perhaps in a different way, in a different word, the background to my activities. Dr. Meskins and Dr. Kodama, you talked about science and arts kind of in a way in a parallel of each other. And Mako-san, you had slightly different approach. You talked about the phenomena of art, action of art and action of science. And I myself would like to have a more formalized way of questioning in quite a violent way, maybe. So Glenn Kazuma, the dancer, said that the body does not lie. That's an important element. And also, Professor Kodama's the Bayesian model talked about how much data to put in the beginning, injecting in the beginning, and he said selecting only what you want. And going back to my theme of contract and confidence or trusting, so trusting or confidence, so being aware and forgetting, doing or not doing. From the contract perspective, to lie, to come to closer to the truth, to be closer to the truth in a fair manner, and to understand, not to understand. These are the verbs that are important. What happens then? Kodama-san had mentioned, and in a way, Glenn Kazuma declared that body does not lie. What does it mean? Well, that is the first question. Now, the first awareness is not the target of the scientific proofing. It's a very logical question. You can pick any target as a scientific study, but you have to come up with a statement. Something and something is something. Well, A and B. So a statement. In order for a statement to stand, we have to have the verb is. So, which means that being rational, you need to have that kind of sentence or syntax structure. In order to connect science to the society, we have to, in some way, ground ourselves into the real world, accepting the world of mathematics. But if we were to ground ourselves into the current reality of the world, we cannot fully ground ourselves because the society is already very much artificial, and we are starting ourselves with the start point of lies, of being lied to by someone. So on the basis of truth, there are lies, and the lies are recreated or generated as a result, possibly. And so in that sense, what does it mean to say that body does not lie? Well, this is to be aware, to forget, to not to be aware. Well, to forget that you're not even aware. Well, up until here, this is just a question of logic or rationale. So we can be aware in a logical or rational manner of absence. But what is absence? We need to understand what is absent in relation to the real world. So in that sense, a very naked statement is body does not lie. And I think that is a very necessary statement. So going back to reputational damage, we started from midway. So therefore, once it had started, we are not even aware of the fact that we are forced to forget that we are not even aware. As if reputational damage is the first condition without being aware of things that we have forgotten. So in a way, I am very formal person, and I have no sense of direct contact with the world. So in that sense, I think if we can just break through these barriers just with art, I think that is a wonderful phenomena. By the way, Professor, earlier you had this filling in the blank questions, and I was very happy that I was basically right. I was able to answer most of the questions. Are we outside of the world or inside of the world? Well, I can't answer that question, but I think art can answer that question. The absence of being aware of absence, well, that awareness you can obtain through logic. But what do we not know? What is absent? How can we express that in a positive way? Well, science cannot do it. I cannot do it. I think art is the only tool or method that allows us to talk about that in a positive manner. In a way, this has nothing to do with reputational damage. Sorry. The art's role to be positive role of arts. Well, how about music? What do you think about the positive role of art that Kageura-san said? How about music? Maybe your music, maybe you're not on the top charts or billboards, but people who listen to your music, and I know that a lot of people respond to your music. Sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Well, we were talking about the possible role of art, possible functionality of art. And in that sense, well, recently, you have been active not only in the radiation, but also you have been talking a lot about the constitution, Japanese constitution, and in that sense, you have been quite aware of these issues and in your artist activity as well. So, what do you think? It's a very broad question, I believe. Well, what I was thinking vaguely was that, well, we have so many panelists from very different professional stance, role, and expertise, giving different opinions. But in the very beginning of today's session, we had the pictures. Well, I was talking about Takachi Morizumi's photo exhibit that I was talking about. In my presentation, I mentioned his photo exhibit. Well, when I saw the pictures, well, this is the two-dimensional reality, right? Photos. Well, or when I look at someone's word or someone's songs or performing art, what we are trying to do is that as an audience, we are sympathizing. Very flatly speaking, we are sharing experience and we are sympathizing. So even if what is shown is very different from your own reality, in a certain way, we sympathize. And there are certain things that we can sympathize only because they are completely different culture, different words.
Let's say we watch the science fiction movies and action movies just like that. It's very different from your reality, but the same human beings are going through certain experience, and that's where you sympathize yourself with. So, let's say human beings going through lots of emotions, happy, sad, angry. And what happens to you yourself? That's the question you fundamentally have to yourself. That's why you're happy by looking at the sports events, or you get sad looking at the theater, or you hurt yourself by looking at the documentary, you get upset. So what we're doing as an artist is that putting aside whether that generates sympathy or not, our role is to let them sympathize. So what I can look at it is that the opposite force, the force that's trying to stop you from being sympathetic or to resonate, that's a very cold force, not to let you sympathize. As an individual, you get numerics, you're just obliged to do certain things, and you're so fulfilled with your own life. You don't resonate, you don't sympathize with others, you don't feel nothing. That's a tragedy for human beings. And do you really see that as a tragedy or not? Again, that intensity level might be different depending on the person, and I think that's a challenge. So, myself, my profession is so-called the underground, non-pop things, non-pop culture things, but non-pop perspective. I feel like my mission is to address something that's non-pop, and this is part of my role in this activism. So at the end of the day, as a human being, putting aside whether you are influenced or not, it's about resonance. It's a degree of resonance. Give me one more minute. Yesterday, in my life, 70 years after World War II, I wanted to share this episode with you. When I was 20 years old. Well, for 20 years or so, I've been doing my rap. But back in 20 years old, in Bosnia, Mostar was the city I visited. And I resonated with people in Kosovo, what was happening. It was about the war. I sympathized with people there. And by having a sympathy, I feel like I was drawn to the opportunity of visiting that space. I went to the live. I met Brian Eno, all these famous people there. And so I went to Kosovo, Bosnia. And a few years ago, there was a war. And this city, young people like me, a few years ago, were killing people. They were forced to kill people. And these people took me around, showed me around the city. And he was saying, well, this is where I had the gunfights. He's just taking me for sightseeing. And what I felt back then was that now I'm here with you. And I'm sharing my art. What I can do is just singing. But what's more important is to listen to them. That's what I thought. And the same in Fukushima. Or very same to what you're going through as an experience. Whatever we can do is, of course, we can provide goods and everything, but the biggest thing we can do is listen. So according to those young people in Bosnia, during the war, they kill. Their friends die, but they didn't cry at all because they were machines. But now, war is over. So tomorrow, if my friend dies, I know I'm going to cry because I'm now back to human. That's what he's told me. So he was, all these young people were the same age, different culture, living in a different place, but going through this kind of experience. It made me think a lot. So the question is, I didn't go through that reality, but I saw the consequence. I met these people. So the question is, how can we sympathize with these people? I thought about that. And then before that, I had very negative view or very strong stance against the society, no interview whatsoever. But now it changed me. I wanted to do something so that I can instigate people's mindsets. I wanted to sympathize with others. That's how my activity started. Well, you talked about sympathy. In Fukushima, the issue in Fukushima, when you think about that, we're at the very difficult stage, I believe. I talked about base assumption, base forecasting model. So if you have a wrong forecast, things didn't go well. If that happens, things get worsened. And if things get worsened, then the even more terrible forecast can come up so that you can gamble. So, Mr. Meskins, you talked about the comfort zone and you talked about the split among the comfort zone. And I mean, Minamisoma, Hamadori, Namie, Naraha, decontamination. I'm involved in those regions, and the situation is very serious. But none of the people are letting people know about this serious situation. All the journalists are silent. Artists don't talk about this. The nuclear power plant accidents, after that takes place, I think this is crazy. This is not normal. Japanese electricity companies, well, I'm also involved in computer science. For example, the companies who lost in the semiconductor purchased and acquired all these nuclear power plant companies. And Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, 1 trillion yen, spending 1 trillion yen, or Toshiba, Westinghouse, Hitachi, GE. This huge thing is happening now with those corporations. Radiation, separate from radiation discussions, in the field of manufacturing business, in the energy discussion, what we talk about is that nuclear energy is cheap, clean, no problem with the health. It's like combined together and aggressively being discussed. Against such backdrop, well, I'm involved in the decontamination, and I'm a leader of the committee for decontaminating the Naraha city. And September 5th, there is a release of return. Release. Don't take me wrong. The government is just saying that it's a return of people. But people always wanted to restore the environment. That voice of people are not being conveyed. So people are back to the region, Narahamachi. Let's say the biggest facility is called the J Village. And J Village belongs to TEPCO. And nothing to do with Olympics. J Village. TEPCO is not doing anything about J Village. And when we talk about Narahamachi restoration and other regions restoration, nothing really can happen. Well, scientists should never be emotional. Well, as I talked in diet, TV and demonstrations, that's a repetition of motives. So if there is a mathematic formula comes out, we have to come up with a different mathematic formula. The existing model, the different model needs to exist from an existing model. Well, we need to keep assume the Mercury and Pluto. So we first of all have to look into the reality. That's called science, and then you need the senses to pursue science. However, what my sense is telling me is that the reality is wrong. But in Japan, do we have a stronger force to push back? So we give antibody to the disease.
Antibiotics to the bacteria. But what we do about superbug, that is the major issue that we are dealing with. Human actions, human activities, when some accident or disease occur, the way human being face actually have major impact on the outcome. If the bacteria can even become a superbug, same as cancer cells. We are looking at the prostate cancer. Well, eventually, when you use the anti-cancer drug, they undertake metastasis to become a bone cancer. And the same goes for Fukushima. Well, the artists, scientists, experts, what people are doing and not doing after the Fukushima accident is creating Japan that is completely different or wrong. That's what I would like to ask. But now things seems to be going wrong. And this current situation actually suggests that the situation is even more serious than before the March 11th accident. And that is something that should be considered more and debated more starting today. Thank you very much. Cecile, please. Very short comment, because I was not planning to speak today. Professor Kodama, what you had just said is really right on the mark. We, for a very long time, have been wondering about what should be the real role of science. This is something that we have been thinking for the past 4 years. And now, in Japan, and not only in Japan, the issue not really is science, but the issue is the politics. Science is a mere tool of politics. Any data can be assembled. We are scientists, so we think about lies. Well, concept of responsibility, when we think about that, we need to seek out lies. What is the society where we live in? Why do scientists lie today? I think that is a very simple way of putting things. And I will be talking more in detail in 2 dates. In June, InWorks is a new study result that was issued. 300,000 nuclear power plant workers were the subject of this study. This was a very long-term study, and as a result of this study called InWorks, what became clear was the relationship between the low-dose radiation and cancer. So just within 1 month of the release of the result of this study in works, Japanese government raised the limitation or threshold of the dosage to 250 millisievert. It's not a lie. It's not a joke. It's an unbelievable situation. There is no room for discussions or not. We can't even. It's at a level that is beyond debate. The reason why I mentioned about this is because I am from CNRS. I work for National Institute of Research, and I work closely with the French embassy in Japan. At the time of the March 11th, the French government only talked about what TEPCO had to say. And I was observing the whole situation. A lot of French people were saying that in France, the media is talking about how Japanese government is lying and how situation is dangerous. And I was wondering, think about France. France has nuclear power as well. The first thing we need to do is to really demolish this structure. This is not a Japanese specific issue. And this fascist way of thinking is occurring in Japan. And Gaston rightly said earlier, well, you were quite angry last time when you made that statement earlier, and you said so much. But you said, well,
society which are concerned by human being is concerning by art. You say that. And で、今日本の人権科学というんですかね。
in the science.
大学の中の
How can I
社会科学の
in the social science departments in university, many of these social sciences departments are closing down. There seems to be no future in these fields of studies. Well, I haven't talked so much about arts. I'm sorry, because I'm not an artist. But when you go on site, well, I go to Fukushima and the afflicted area. I go to the temporary housing and talk to the residents there. And I talk to these people individually, but each and everyone has to say such heavy stories, and they talk with such heavy words. And it's almost not inexpressible. That's why I started creating these pieces of work that I'm exhibiting in the back of this room, because I can't express them with words, because arts in a way it could be utilized in battle. As a result, well, there's a monochrome picture, which are the pictures of just water. It's water. But when I took these pictures, I wanted to express that these contaminated waters are flowing everywhere. And people are used to this situation. People are used to this news story. But actually, when you think about this, this is a major destruction. And we need to go back and rely on the true potential or the power of nature. That's what I wanted to say in my artwork, and that's all I wanted to say today. I'm sorry, I'm not very coming up with a clear conclusion. Cecile, you say you're not the artist, but you do you feel that you need to create such artwork, such pictures, in order to digest what you have heard in the afflicted area. And no matter how individual issue, you think that it's also an international issue as well. Clearly, when it comes to nuclear power, Japan has strong connection with France. Aliva and Mitsubishi have a lot of contracts, and a lot of money is moving between these two countries and two companies. 4 years ago, well, every year in the Japan France Cultural Institute, we undertake and we organize a symposium. And at very beginning, even from the very beginning, there was a lot of conflicts because when we listen to individual speakers, well, we talk about can we decontaminate in Namie, or should some certain people return to a certain town? What about the evacuation zone? But these are very polemical issues, but it's important to talk about them. But these are just results and outcomes. But and people say let's just first get working and undertake decontamination. But things are moving forward. So in that sense, discussion and action have to take place simultaneously. We need to think at the same time as we act. Otherwise, the same thing could happen anywhere, everywhere.
So there are new Areba is selling lots of new nuclear power facilities, and Iraq is a great market for weapons. So Japan seems to be very willing to join that market. France the same. So there's this international understanding in place, and then we have to work on this decontamination work. Thank you very much. Mr. Meskins, we would like to throw the ball back to you to conclude. And in your talk, we talked about art, geijutsu, gijutsu, and Cecile, you talked about how to be strategic. There's a role that art can play to criticize this manipulated situation, and also more of a consolidate positioning of the consolatory aesthetics. Back in Da Vinci, in Renaissance, you've been going through the changes of geijutsu and bijutsu, the art form. What is your view on the this art and science relationship? That's a big question. Well, when I look at it from my own personal perspectives, after the earthquake, what can art do? I wrote lots of articles about that. And what I wrote back then, right after the accident, was that what can I do? Personally, I can ask, but I can never ask what art can do. Of course, I can talk about the past of what art did. When we say art, when we have, well, we can talk about the art, the language itself. Artist, art, what's missing the most now is the art piece is accountable to me. If something happens, if I'm exposed to criticisms, I have to keep updating the art piece. I just cannot just repetitively make the same thing. But in case of science, in general, discovery is there. Of course, the Nobel Prize is given, but when the problem happens, there's no individual bearing the accountability. So, who made nuclear power plants? Well, can you question that? We cannot step forward, move forward. So that was very evident. I'm from Hokkaido, and Tomari nuclear power plant. There is this introductory corner there in Tomari that was quite interesting. At the entrance, you see Amazon water tank, Africa fish swimming in the tank. And everyone looking at it, how beautiful it is. Tomari is a very well-known fishing place, and there used to be a very unique fish. But why are they showing Amazon fish? All they wrote about was the safety myth. When I started off Biennale, the first one I had was an exhibition at the Fukushima airport, and that was about nuclear power plant. The professor Heshiodos, well, the god created the disaster to punish human beings. Prometheus and other myths are there, and I just thought that science might advance, but human never advance. What I mean is that it's about individual and groups, collectiveness. Maybe in case of anatomy, when I draw my hand, everyone has different shapes of hands. But let's say from an anatomy perspective, you can talk about commonality of hands among all people. Art cannot be created unless you go to extremes. So what if you wave your hands? How are you going to express that waving hands? If the time comes into play, everything changes. Well, the answer is not pages of photos put together as a booklet just to show that when the hands seem to be waving. So we do need a bridge, and art has a role to play to serve as a bridge so that two bipolarized situations can be connected together, culture and civilization. Just like agriculture, culture is about soil being foundation to grow something. When it comes to civilization, it's about enlightenment. It's about city, building cities. You want lights, you want to have the same temperature. It's more about civilization. And again, art can play a role of bridging the two. Some people go against each other, but again, artist has accountability. I think that's the biggest difference between art and science. May I? I heard Professor Watanabe's accountability on science. Well, science, you cannot take any responsibility because when you think about science, it's about the science revolution written by Thomas Cook. And back then, based upon the discipline that you think is correct, and someone who pursued that is regarded as scientist. Who deviates from that is not regarded as a science back then. So right at the moment, whatever you think is correct is so-called the scientist. So, well, everyone is accountable from that perspective. Scientist who created something, it's not an individual accountability. It's based upon a certain discipline that they believe in. I think that's how they conclude if something happens to whatever they created as scientists. So you might disagree, or you might criticize me, but science, art, comparing the two, I don't think it's a good comparison. May I? I think that's a very key point that you just talked about. Fukushima accident. If something like that happens, there's always a term being used. Language. You have to be aware that there are multiple languages. What you talked about, the definition, is that there's mainstream for science, and there's this particular discipline, and then there's definition of peer review. But I don't think that's a fundamental definition of science myself. As we discuss kind of these themes, we want you to be careful that the language, the term, what you're talking about, the definition of science, this mainstreams created by science, the society, But there's always different type of non-mainstream languages. So there is multiple layer of language, and that's how science being supported. I think this is a key point. So there's one language, and that defines science. But that's not necessarily the representative of so-called the science. And my view is that when it comes to the medical situations, in the 20th century and 21st century medicine, the difference is second opinion, having a second opinion. The doctor's language and non-doctor patient's language now is understood. So there's this mainstream language needs to be looked at it from a relative perspectives. And by doing so, you can have lots of different perspectives and different forecasts. So again, we want you to have a multi-layer, faceted view. So there is this language defined by the mainstreams, but we can create different type of language created by the non-mainstream parties.
Regarding what Nagahata-san said, I think I need to add some words. Well, currently, people seem to think as you say, and people seem to have such understanding in general today. However, what could science be, or what should science be? We were trying to discuss that answer. But in that context, now science tends to be used in such a way. Well, that is what Nagahata-san said just now is true in that sense of in mainstream, that seems to be the understanding in terms of the role of science, but that's not necessarily what it should be or what it could be. So that's just a word that I wanted to add. In terms of language, well, earlier Professor Kodama talked about returns of evacuees, and I was really thinking about that since then, about the return. I'm sorry if I misunderstood or misheard, but Professor Kodama, you mentioned about Naraha and J Village, and you talked about reconstruction. Now, we were talking about, you also mentioned decontamination, but you were talking about the return of evacuees. I'm reporting about this as well. What is issue with the return of the evacuees is not only the reconstruction, but I believe that decontamination is, or the contamination, sorry, radiation contamination is an important issue of why there is such a polemic of when it comes to the issue of the returns. And I was surprised that you didn't mention the radiation contamination as an issue behind return. This is really the key question I have when I think about science or when I face science today. Right after the accident in Itate village, they said that children can play outside up until 10 millisievert per hour. A certain expert said that very clearly in NHK TV, and this person still is very active as a official committee member from the government side in Fukushima and in Japan, and that is the main question that I have since the March 11th accident. I'm sure there are a lot of people from Fukushima here, and I have asked these people, and I've asked a lot of people in Fukushima. We talk about reconstruction, we talk about reputational damage. Because of that, a lot of people cannot talk about the concerns they have of the aftermath of the nuclear accident. And this is a major issue. How can we solve this issue? I believe this is the major theme of this symposium. So therefore, Kageura-san, I wanted to ask you more about reputational damage. Well, science and arts. After the nuclear accident, science is looked at by the general public with so much doubtful eyes. And in that backdrop, the importance of sympathizing, the importance of suggesting solutions to people, I think that is a very key topic of arts, I believe. That is a very important statement, I believe. But if we were to really try to find an answer to this question, then it may be very time-consuming. I have been asking, making you wait for such a long time, Gaston.
I think this was a very interesting discussion. There's lots of ideas that still need so much more reflection, of course. But maybe as a general thought to close this panel debate with, I think we all agree that the Fukushima case is in need of social justice and that it is not there yet. And then if you look at what could be the specific roles or possible contributions of art and science, and Cecile rightly said that, of course, we also need to take into account the social sciences and especially the humanities and philosophy in that sense. Then I think there's some, and many people referred to it in their own ways here, there's some specific roles and possibilities that we can assign to them. If you look at science, of course, science has a role to play in reaching social justice. It could reveal potential health effects and prove that there are health effects. But it also has an accountability. It should also honestly and openly and fair tell society if it cannot prove that there are health effects. So there's this accountability of science that it should not really give into the pressure of politics and the market to deliver something it cannot deliver. So that's also a responsibility in terms of social justice. If you look at art and philosophy, maybe it sounds provocative, but art and philosophy cannot help us to reach social justice in Fukushima. But they can show why we need it. They cannot really enforce or stimulate social justice, but they can show why we need it, each in their own way, towards those accountable, the politicians, the engineers, the experts, but also towards the public. And if the first are too cynical to listen, the politicians and the experts, then it can still show the public why we need social justice, in which way. It can, as well, art as philosophy can uphold critical mirrors to those cynically detached. And if they don't look in the mirror, the politicians, then hopefully we can help the citizens to be enlightened about what social justice would mean in this case. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry for my inadequate moderation of the panel discussion, but this is the 5th symposium, and this is the first time that in the CSRP symposium we were really trying to find the relation between the arts and science. And in a way, my initial question was way too wide, way too wide. And I'm sorry about that, but it allowed us to have a very broad discussions. And I hope that this lead to an even better discussion tomorrow and day after. Thank you very much for your attention.